The morning after the blizzard, they found nothing where their neighbors' cabins used to be. Collapsed walls, splintered beams half buried under 4 feet of snow, a cast-iron stove sitting exposed in the open air, its chimney snapped off at the base. 3 families had lost everything in a single night, a night that reached a recorded low of minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit across the Northern Territories. And yet, 50 yards away, something stood completely untouched. No cracked walls, no broken roof, no frozen pipes, no panic inside, just a tall, strange tower of stacked fieldstone, the same structure the settlement had mocked for 2 full seasons. The same structure one local account describes as a folly built by a man who does not understand this land. The same structure that, by the morning of February 14, 1886, still held an interior temperature warm enough to sleep without extra blankets. Nobody outside could explain it. The tower was taller than anything else in the valley, and in a land of brutal wind and killing cold, tall was supposed to mean exposed. Tall was supposed to mean dangerous. Every experienced homesteader in the region knew you built low, dug in, and kept your profile small against the storm. This man had done the opposite, and his choice, dismissed as stubbornness or ignorance or worse, turned out to hold a principle of thermal engineering so effective that it would keep the interior warm for over 12 hours without a single log added to the firebox. The neighbors who had laughed were now standing at his door. Something about that tower was different. Not just in its shape, not just in its stone. The secret was buried in decisions made before the first wall ever rose, in the way heat moved, in the weight of the rock, in a logic that looked like madness from the outside and like genius from within. This is the story of how one man built against every convention of his time, and how a single blizzard proved every skeptic wrong. If you've ever wondered whether the old ways of building were truly primitive, or whether we've simply forgotten something important, subscribe and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. You might be closer to this story than you think. His name, according to oral accounts collected decades later by a regional historical society in the Northern Territories, was Callum Mackinnon, a Finnish-Scottish stonemason who had arrived in the valley sometime around 1879, carrying little more than a set of iron chisels, a surveying rod, and a mind shaped by 2 very different traditions of cold weather building. He had grown up in the coastal lowlands of Finland, where winter was not a season but a sentence. Stone was the material of churches, of forts, of structures meant to last beyond memory. Wood was fast. Wood was cheap. Wood was also, in his father's words, a material that forgets the cold exists and then is surprised when it arrives. Oral records suggest Callum's father had been a builder too, and that the family had spent at least one winter in a partially stone structure on the Finnish coast that, by all accounts passed down through the family, held warmth long after the woodpile ran out. When Callum arrived in the Northern Valley, he studied the land for nearly a full year before breaking ground. He watched how the wind moved through the tree line. He noted where snow accumulated deepest and where it didn't. He pressed his hand flat against exposed rock faces on the hillside at different hours of the day, measuring warmth with his palm the way a baker measures an oven. Neighbors later recalled him crouching beside outcroppings of granite and sandstone at midday, eyes closed, fingers spread wide against the surface. They thought he was strange. They weren't wrong, but strange and mistaken are not the same thing. When he finally began construction in the spring of 1881, the community watched with a mix of curiosity and barely concealed derision. He had chosen a slight rise in the terrain, not the flattest, most convenient ground, but a position with natural drainage and a southern exposure that would catch low winter sunlight for the maximum number of hours. He dug his foundation deeper than anyone in the valley had dug before, nearly 4 feet into the subsoil, where the earth held a stable temperature of around 42 degrees Fahrenheit year-round regardless of surface conditions. And then, instead of spreading outward the way every other cabin in the settlement did, he began to build up. The walls went higher, and higher still. By the time the first course of windows was set, the structure stood nearly 18 feet at its lowest point, roughly twice the height of the tallest neighboring cabin. By completion, The central tower reached just over 26 feet at its stone parapet. The comment started almost immediately. A man building a castle in the wilderness. One local account records a neighbor saying. Another oral history, compiled by a schoolteacher in the region in the 1920s, quotes a settler describing Callum's tower as a fine place to freeze to death at altitude. The joke circulated through the valley for 2 winters. It became the kind of story people told at communal gatherings. The eccentric Finscott who thought height would save him from cold, when every sensible person knew the wind would strip a tall building bare in January. Callum, by all reconstructed accounts, said very little in response. He continued laying stone. He chinked the walls with a mixture of clay, animal hair, and crushed limestone, a traditional mortar blend common in parts of coastal Finland and the Scottish Highlands, where builders had learned through generations that rigid mortars cracked under freeze-thaw cycles while flexible blend survived. He said his windows, small and deep-set, angled slightly downward to catch low southern sun while blocking the high, direct summer glare. None of it looked like engineering to the untrained eye. It looked like stubbornness. It looked like pride. It looked like a man who refused to be corrected. The first 2 winters in the tower were unremarkable, cold enough to test the structure, but not catastrophic. Callum burned less firewood than his neighbors. He mentioned this in passing, according to a later account from a man who traded goods with him regularly. No one paid much attention. Wood was plentiful that decade, and efficiency seemed like a strange thing to brag about in a land where the forest stretched for hundreds of miles. Then came the winter of 1885 to 1886, and everything changed. To understand why Callum built tall and why it worked, you have to first understand why everyone else built low. The conventional wisdom of frontier construction in the Northern Territories during the 1870s and 1880s was built on a single, rational fear: wind. A low-profile cabin presented less surface area to the storm. Less wall meant less infiltration. Less height meant less exposure to the brutal wind shear that could strip heat from a structure the way a blade strips bark from a log. Every experienced homesteader knew this. It was passed down like gospel, and it was not wrong as far as it went. The problem was that it only addressed one half of the thermal equation. It thought about what the cold could take. It never asked what the structure could give back. Callum had grown up around builders who thought differently. In the coastal regions of Finland and in the stone-building tradition of the Scottish Highlands, height was not the enemy of warmth. It was, under the right conditions, one of its engines. The principle is rooted in basic physics, and it operates whether you understand it or not. Hot air rises. This is not a frontier opinion. It is a law of thermodynamics called natural convection, and it governs every heated space that has ever existed. In a short, squat cabin, the warm air produced by the firebox rises quickly, hits a low ceiling, spreads laterally, and loses its heat to the cold roof and upper walls almost immediately. The occupants feel the warmth near the stove and little else. The heat is generated, rises, and escapes, a cycle that demands constant fuel to maintain. In a tall structure with thick stone walls, something different happens. The warm air still rises, but now it has distance to travel. As it moves upward through 20 or 26 feet of interior space, it transfers heat progressively to the stone walls on either side. The stone absorbs that heat slowly, the way a boulder left in the sun absorbs solar radiation. Not quickly, not dramatically, but deeply. Sandstone and granite, the primary materials Callum used in the tower's construction, have a specific heat capacity that allows them to store thermal energy for between 8 and 14 hours, depending on wall thickness and ambient temperature differential. Callum's walls were between 20 and 24 inches thick at their base, tapering to 16 inches near the parapet. That is not a wall. That is a battery. By the time the warm air completed its journey to the upper portion of the tower, it had deposited a significant fraction of its thermal energy into the stone. When the fire burned low or went out entirely, the walls did not immediately surrender that warmth to the outside. They held it. They radiated it back inward, slowly and steadily, across the interior space, hours after the last log had turned to ash. This is called radiant heat return, and it is the principle that separates a heated building from a thermally massive one. But Callum had gone further than simply building tall. He had also understood, either through inherited knowledge or careful observation, that the geometry of the structure mattered as much as its mass. The tower's roughly square footprint, with its deep-set windows and minimal exterior projections, reduced thermal bridging, the phenomenon by which heat escapes not through the wall itself, but around corners, through frames, and across the thin spots in any structure. His corner joints were not simple, but connections. Local accounts describe them as interlocked, stones cut to fit across each corner in alternating courses, creating a thermal grip that prevented cold air from finding a path through the junction. Modern builders call this technique coining. It was standard practice in Scottish and Finnish vernacular construction. In the northern valley of the 1880s, no one had seen it done before. They saw the result. They did not understand the reason. That gap between visible result and invisible mechanism is where most engineering wisdom goes to die. And for Callum Mackinnon, it meant 2 winters of quiet competence before the land itself provided the evidence that no argument could. There is a specific quality of cold that experienced northern builders describe in oral accounts as stone cold, and they do not mean it as a metaphor. They mean the cold that penetrates material itself, the cold that gets inside the walls, the cold that a wooden structure absorbs and then radiates inward, slowly converting every beam and plank into a refrigerating surface rather than a sheltering one. What is a poor thermal mass? It is lightweight, which makes it fast to build with and easy to transport. Its cellular structure traps air, which gives it modest, insulating properties in mild conditions. But under sustained extreme cold, temperatures that remain below 0 degrees Fahrenheit for days without rising, that same cellular structure becomes a liability. Wood contracts. Gaps open at joints. The air pockets that provided insulation become pathways for convective heat loss. And because wood has low thermal mass, it stores almost no heat of its own. When the fire dies in a wooden cabin, the interior temperature begins dropping within the hour. This was not theoretical knowledge for the settlers of the Northern Valley. They lived with it every winter. Oral histories describe the ritual of the night fire, waking every 3 to 4 hours to add wood to the stove, because allowing the fire to die meant waking to an interior temperature that could drop to within 20 degrees Fahrenheit of the outside air by morning. In a winter that regularly saw overnight lows of minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, that was not discomfort. That was danger. Callum's tower did not require a night fire. This detail, perhaps more than any other, is what eventually silenced the mockery, but only after the great blizzard made the difference impossible to ignore. In the winters before 1886, those who traded with Callum or visited the tower occasionally noted that he slept through the night without tending the stove. Some assumed he was simply reckless. Some assumed the stone structure must be drafty and cold regardless. No one asked the right question, which was, what temperature was the interior actually holding? The answer, reconstructed from accounts collected later, was between 52 degrees Fahrenheit and 58 degrees Fahrenheit by morning in moderate winter conditions, without any fire added after approximately 10 p.m. the previous evening. A standard wooden cabin under the same conditions, with a night fire tended twice, might hold between 48 degrees Fahrenheit and 55 degrees Fahrenheit near the stove and considerably less, sometimes as low as 34 degrees Fahrenheit, in the far corners and sleeping areas. The stone walls of the tower were doing something the wood walls simply could not. They were acting as a slow-release thermal reservoir. Here is the mechanism in plain terms. During the hours when the firebox was burning, typically from late afternoon through early evening, the interior air temperature rose to somewhere between 68 degrees Fahrenheit and 74 degrees Fahrenheit. That warm air circulated through the tower's vertical interior, pressing against the stone walls and transferring energy through direct contact. Stone absorbs this energy the way a cast iron skillet absorbs heat from a flame, slowly, evenly, and deeply. The thermal mass of the tower's walls, estimated at somewhere between 180,000 and 220,000 pounds of fieldstone, sandstone, and granite in total, was capable of absorbing and storing a substantial quantity of that heat before the fire was banked for the night. Once the fire reduced to coals and the interior air temperature began to fall, the process reversed. The walls, now slightly warmer than the surrounding air, began radiating heat back into the space. Not dramatically, not like a stove, but steadily, persistently, the way a rock pulled from a fire radiates warmth in your hands long after the flames are gone. Multiplied across tens of thousands of square feet of interior wall surface, that gentle radiant output was enough to slow the temperature drop dramatically. In a wooden cabin, the thermal flywheel had almost no mass. The fire went out, and the interior temperature chased the exterior within hours. In Callum's tower, the flywheel weighed over 100 tons. It could not stop on a dime. He had also made two additional choices that compounded this effect. First, he had constructed an interior partition wall, a secondary stone wall roughly 8 inches thick running east to west through the lower level of the tower, creating a divided ground floor. This partition absorbed additional heat from the firebox and added thermal mass to the most occupied living space without increasing the exterior footprint of the structure. Second, he had positioned his firebox not against an exterior wall, as was standard practice in nearly every cabin in the valley, but against the interior partition wall itself so that both faces of the partition received radiant heat from the fire simultaneously. The exterior walls stayed cold on their outer faces and warm on their inner faces. The partition wall, surrounded by heated interior air on both sides, stayed warm throughout. It was not magic. It was geometry meeting physics, guided by a knowledge tradition that predated the settlement by several centuries. No thermal mass system works in isolation. The stone walls of Callum's tower could store heat, but only if heat was delivered to them efficiently. And the efficiency of that delivery depended entirely on the relationship between the firebox, the chimney, and the geometry of the interior space. This is where Callum's second major departure from frontier convention becomes visible. In a standard frontier cabin of the 1870s and 1880s, the fireplace or cast iron stove was positioned against an exterior wall, almost universally on the gable end of the structure. This placement had practical roots. It shortened the chimney run, made installation easier, and reduced the risk of interior fire from a poorly constructed flue. It was logical, defensible, and thermally wasteful in ways that most settlers never fully quantified. When a stove or fireplace sits against an exterior wall, a significant portion of the heat it generates radiates outward, directly through the wall and into the cold outside air. The masonry surrounding the firebox, if it shares a face with the exterior, becomes a thermal bridge, a pathway by which the energy you have burned would to create exits the building before it can warm the people inside. Oral accounts and regional builder records from the era suggest that a well-operated exterior wall fireplace in a wooden cabin transferred as much as 40% of its radiant energy outward rather than inward, particularly in structures where the chimney breast extended outside the building envelope. Callum placed his firebox against his interior partition wall, as described in the previous chapter. But the chimney, the element most critical to the tower's thermal performance, was where his knowledge of draft physics became most visible. A chimney functions through a principle called stack effect or thermal draft. Hot gases produced by combustion are lighter than the surrounding cold air. They rise. As they rise through the flue, they create a pressure differential. Lower pressure at the base of the chimney draws fresh combustion air in through the firebox, and the hot exhaust gases are pulled upward and out. The taller the chimney, the greater the pressure differential, and the stronger the draft. A stronger draft means more efficient combustion. The fire burns hotter and cleaner, extracting more heat energy from each pound of wood. In a low-profile cabin with a short chimney run, perhaps 10 to 14 feet from firebox to cap, the draft was modest. The fire burned adequately, but not optimally. Incomplete combustion wasted a fraction of the fuel's potential heat energy and produced more creosote in the flue, increasing the risk of chimney fire. Callum's chimney ran the full interior height of the tower before exiting at the parapet, a vertical run of nearly 22 feet from firebox throat to flue cap. This produced a draft that, by all reconstructed accounts, was notably stronger than anything in the valley. Oral histories from traders who visited the tower in winter describe a fire that caught fast, burned with a deep, steady roar, and required less wood per hour than the stoves in neighboring cabins to produce equivalent warmth. The chimney's long interior run had a second effect. The flue itself became a heat exchanger. As hot combustion gases traveled upward through 22 feet of enclosed stone flue, they surrendered heat to the surrounding masonry before exiting. In a short chimney, those gases exit the building still carrying a large fraction of the fire's thermal energy, heat that rises into the sky and is gone. In Callum's tower, much of that energy was deposited into the chimney mass itself, which then radiated it back into the interior space over the following hours. The firebox, the partition wall, the chimney mass, and the exterior stone walls were not four separate components. They functioned as a single integrated thermal system, each element absorbing, storing, and returning heat in a coordinated cycle that multiplied the effective output of each log burned. Estimates based on comparable stone structures of the period suggest that Callum's system extracted somewhere between 65% and 75% of the available heat energy from each cord of wood he burned, compared to approximately 30% to 45% for a typical open hearth fireplace of the era. In practical terms, this meant he burned roughly half the firewood his neighbors consumed to maintain a warmer interior through a longer portion of the night. Half the wood, warmer walls, a fire that didn't need tending until morning. His neighbors were burning twice as much timber to achieve less, and they thought he was the one who didn't understand the land. The irony, of course, is that the land was about to settle the argument, not with words, but with weather. There are winters that test a structure, and then there are winters that sentence it. The season of 1885 to 1886 across the Northern Territories was not a gradual hardening of temperatures. It arrived the way a verdict arrives, sudden, final, and without appeal. Regional weather records from the period, preserved in part through territorial surveyor logs and missionary station diaries, describe the autumn of 1885 as deceptively mild. October was warm enough that several settlers delayed their firewood cutting. November softened their concern further, and then December arrived and did not behave like December. By the third week of the month, temperatures in the valley had dropped to minus 14 degrees Fahrenheit overnight and were not recovering above 12 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. The ground froze to a depth that cracked the stone foundations of at least two recently built cabins, structures whose footings had been set shallow, the way it was done quickly, the way it was done by men who expected the land to be forgiving. It was not forgiving that winter. The settlers tightened their routines. Families doubled their wood consumption. Night fires became mandatory rather than precautionary. Children were kept indoors. Livestock were crowded into smaller spaces for shared warmth. And more than one account from the period describes the smell of cattle in the lower room of a family's dwelling as an accepted feature of survival rather than an indignity. Callum Mackinnon continued his usual rhythm. He was seen by a neighbor splitting a modest stack of wood in the first week of January, a quantity the neighbor later described as not nearly enough for what was coming. He said nothing to correct this assessment. He simply worked and stacked and returned inside. Then, on the night of February 13th, 1886, the blizzard arrived. It came from the northwest, which was the worst possible direction for the valley, because the terrain offered no natural windbreak from that quarter. The wind built through the evening, and by midnight it had reached a sustained velocity that later accounts place at somewhere between 40 and 55 miles per hour, with gusts strong enough to overturn a loaded supply sledge left outdoors by one family at the north end of the settlement. Snow did not fall during that storm so much as it was hurled, horizontal, dense, and so fine-grained that it forced its way through every gap in every structure it encountered. Temperature at the height of the storm was recorded at the nearest missionary station as minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit at 2 a.m. on February 14th. adjusted for wind chill, a concept not formally quantified in that era, but viscerally understood by anyone who lived through such a night. The effective thermal exposure on any unprotected surface approached minus 55 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Wood cabins are not sealed structures. They breathe. Every joint between logs, every gap around a window frame, every place where the chinking had cracked or the settling of the structure had opened a hairline fissure, all of it became an entry point for that wind. Oral accounts from survivors describe lying awake listening to the cabin walls groan and flex. One family, whose cabin stood on the eastern edge of the settlement, reported that the wind pressure on the gable end of their structure was strong enough to visibly bow the wall inward. Not by much, but enough to see in firelight. Enough to understand what was happening. 3 structures on the northern side of the settlement failed before dawn. The mechanism of failure was not dramatic in the way people imagine. There was no single catastrophic collapse. The process was quieter and more insidious. The sustained wind pressure worked against the lateral stability of log walls that had been built without deep interlocking corner joints. Chinking cracked and blew inward. Once the wind found a reliable pathway through the wall envelope, it did not simply add cold. It actively evacuated the warm air the stove was desperately trying to produce. The fire burned harder. The wood burned faster. And still the interior temperature dropped, because the cabin had become a sieve rather than a vessel. By the time the families in those 3 structures understood what was happening, their interior temperatures had fallen below 28 degrees Fahrenheit despite burning fires. The walls themselves had reached thermal equilibrium with the outside air. The structures were no longer shelters. They were traps made of freezing wood. They gathered what they could carry and moved through the storm. 50 yards away, the stone tower stood in the wind the way a boulder stands in a river. It did not flex. It did not groan. Its walls, 20 to 24 inches of interlocked field stone and granite, chinked with flexible clanhair mortar that had been packed into every joint in 1881 and had not cracked since, offered the wind no entry point, no gap, no purchase. The thermal mass that the community had dismissed as unnecessary excess was now the only reason anyone in the valley had a warm place to go. The door opened. Callum Mackinnon stood in the frame. He said nothing, by all accounts. He simply stepped aside. The morning of February 14th, 1886 came slowly, the way mornings do after catastrophic nights, as if the light itself was uncertain whether the situation warranted its return. The wind had not fully died. It pulled in long, exhausted gusts from the northwest, throwing loose snow across the settlement in pale curtains. Those who emerged from the tower first described a scene that oral histories from the region would return to for decades afterward. The collapsed walls of one cabin half buried under a drift, its cast-iron stove sitting open to the sky, a single stovepipe section jutting upward at an angle like a broken arm. Nearby, the skeletal frame of second structure leaned dramatically to the east, its roof gone, its remaining walls stripped of chinking and open to the wind on every side. Inside the tower, by contrast, the temperature at dawn was measured by Callum using a simple mercury thermometer, an instrument he kept mounted on the interior partition wall at 51 degrees Fahrenheit. This reading was made more than 10 hours after he had last added wood to the firebox, having banked the coals before the worst of the storm and not added fuel again through the night. The fire, by morning, had reduced to a bed of deep orange coals still producing modest radiant output. 51 degrees Fahrenheit, after minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit outside, after a 10-hour gap in active heating, in a structure that the settlement had collectively dismissed as a thermal liability. For context, a standard wooden cabin of the era, well-built and actively heated through the night with a fire tended every 3 to 4 hours, would typically hold between 48 degrees Fahrenheit and 58 degrees Fahrenheit near the stove. In the far corners and sleeping areas, away from the direct radiant output of the firebox, that same cabin might show readings as low as 32 degrees Fahrenheit to 38 degrees Fahrenheit on a night of ordinary winter cold. On a night like February 13th, with the wind forcing infiltration through every gap in the structure, those far corner temperatures, in surviving wooden cabins were later described by occupants as cold enough to freeze a pan of water left on a shelf. The tower had no cold corners. Its radiant stone walls enclosed the interior from all sides simultaneously. There was no direction in which a person could move away from warmth, because the warmth was not coming from a single point source. It was radiating inward from every surface. The physics of this are straightforward. A central stove heats by radiation and convection in a roughly spherical pattern that diminishes with distance. A thermally massive enclosure heats by surface radiation from all surrounding walls simultaneously, creating a far more uniform thermal environment across the entire occupied space. 3 families spent that night inside the tower. 11 people in a space designed for 1 family. And still, by every account, they were warm. Callum fed the coals at dawn and had the interior back to 64 degrees Fahrenheit within 2 hours. The community gathered outside the tower that morning as the wind dropped and the scale of the damage became visible. There is no single document that records what was said, but the oral histories collected by the regional schoolteacher in the 1920s convey a consistent picture. The same men who had joked about the Finscott's folly for 4 years were standing in the snow, looking at their destroyed or damaged cabins, saying nothing. One account describes a man named Aldous Farron, whose cabin had lost its entire northern wall to the wind, standing for a long time in front of the tower, studying the corner joints, running his hand along the interlocked stone courses without speaking. He had passed that wall hundreds of times in 4 years and never thought to look at how it was built. The mockery did not end immediately. Pride rarely dissolves in a single morning, but it grew quieter. And over the following spring and summer, 5 families in the valley began asking Callum questions they had never asked before. Not about whether to use stone, but about how to do it the way he had done it. About the depth of the foundation. About the thickness of the walls. About where to put the firebox and how to run the chimney and why the corners were cut the way they were. He answered every question. He charged nothing for the knowledge. By 1889, 3 of those 5 families had completed stone and timber hybrid structures with interior partition walls and deep-run chimneys. None of them, according to later accounts, ever again spent a night tending a fire to survive the cold. The blizzard had done what 4 winters of evidence could not. It had made the invisible visible. It had forced a comparison that could not be argued away or attributed to luck or stubbornness or the personality of an eccentric immigrant. The stone had performed. The wood had failed. The arithmetic was brutal and simple and impossible to dismiss. Callum Mackinnon never said he told them so. He didn't need to. There's a version of this story that ends with the blizzard, with the validation of the stone tower and the humbling of the skeptics and a tidy moral about listening to wisdom you don't understand. That version is satisfying. It is also incomplete, because the fuller story is not just about one man and one winter. It is about what happened to his knowledge afterward, and about why, 140 years later, most people in the industrialized world live in structures that would fail the same test his neighbors' cabins failed on February 13, 1886. The 20th century did not improve on Callum's thermal logic. It replaced it. The replacement was not irrational. The industrialization of building materials made wood framing faster, cheaper, and more accessible than at any previous point in history. Dimensional lumber, standardized, pre-cut, uniform, allowed structures to rise in days rather than weeks. Manufactured insulation, beginning with mineral wool in the early 1900s and expanding to fiberglass bats by mid-century, provided a different mechanism for managing heat loss, resistance rather than mass. Instead of storing heat in heavy material, the new approach was to slow the passage of heat through lightweight material. Both approaches work, but they work differently, and the difference matters in ways that the construction industry spent most of the 20th century quietly ignoring. Insulation-based construction, the dominant method in virtually every residential building in North America today, is reactive. It resists heat loss as long as the heat source is operating. Turn off the furnace, cut the power, run out of fuel, and the interior temperature begins its inevitable fall toward ambient. The insulation slows the process, but it cannot reverse it because there is nothing stored in the walls themselves. A 2x6 stud wall with R19 fiberglass insulation holds essentially zero thermal mass. Its heat retention after the mechanical system shuts down can be measured in minutes rather than hours. A 20-inch stone wall with equivalent or even lower insulating R value holds thermal mass that can sustain a habitable interior temperature for between 8 and 18 hours after the heat source is removed, depending on wall thickness, stone density, and the differential between interior and exterior temperatures. This is not an argument against insulation. It is an observation about a single variable optimization that may have traded resilience for convenience without fully accounting for the cost of that trade. The modern American home consumes, on average, somewhere between 40 and 60 million BTUs of energy per year for space heating. A significant portion of that consumption is not heating a cold space. It is compensating for the constant thermal bleeding of lightweight wall assemblies that store nothing and surrender heat the moment the mechanical system cycles off. The furnace runs. The house warms. The furnace stops. The house cools. The furnace runs again. This cycle, sometimes occurring a dozen or more times in a single day, is so normalized that most homeowners have never questioned it. Callum's tower ran one fire per evening and held warmth through the night. His fuel consumption, estimated from oral accounts of his wood-cutting habits and cross-referenced with the heating capacity of comparable stone structures of the period, was somewhere between 1 and 1.5 cords of hardwood per winter season. A well-insulated modern home in a comparable northern climate, one that has passed all current energy codes, burns the equivalent of between 4 and 7 cords of wood in energy expressed as natural gas, fuel oil, or electric resistance, to achieve the same result across the same season. The modern home is not more efficient. It is more convenient. The distinction matters enormously when the grid goes down, the fuel runs out, or the blizzard arrives from the northwest at 2 a.m. on a February night. There is a word for a building that stays habitable after the mechanical systems fail. That word is resilient. Callum's tower was resilient. Most modern construction is not. Not because the engineers who designed it were incompetent, but because resilience was never the primary optimization target. Speed was. Cost was. Scalability was. The knowledge that made Callum's tower work did not disappear. It was simply deprioritized, quietly shelved in the archives of vernacular building traditions while the industry moved on to things that were faster, cheaper, and easier to explain to a bank appraiser. But the blizzards have not been deprioritized. They arrive on schedule. Callum was not inventing anything on that northern hillside in 1881. He was remembering. The principles embedded in his tower, thermal mass, vertical convection, interior chimney placement, interlocked stone corners, deep foundations, were not novel engineering concepts. They were the accumulated output of centuries of cold climate building traditions developed independently across several continents by people who had no choice but to get it right. In the Scottish Highlands, the Black House, a low, thick-walled stone structure with rounded corners, a central hearth, and a roof of turf and thatch, had been refined over roughly 1,000 years to manage exactly the same thermal challenge Callum faced: sustained cold, limited fuel, and the need for a structure that could hold heat long after the fire burned low. The walls of a traditional black house were sometimes 5 to 6 feet thick at the base, not because stone was free, but because mass was the technology. The rounded corners were not aesthetic. They reduced wind pressure and eliminated the thermal bridging that occurred at sharp right-angle junctions. The turf roof provided insulation that commercial roofing materials would not match until the mid-20th century. In Finland and across the Baltic region, the tradition of the stone and timber hybrid structure, combining a massive stone core for thermal storage with timber framing for the upper levels, produced buildings that oral and written accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries consistently describe as warm in winter with modest fuel consumption. The Finnish word for this approach, roughly translated, speaks to the idea of a building that holds its breath against the cold, a structure so well-sealed and so thermally loaded that it resists temperature change the way a deep lake resists freezing, slowly, heavily from the outside in. In the American Southwest, The ancestral Puebloans built multi-story stone and adobe structures whose south-facing walls absorbed solar radiation through the day and released it through the night. A passive solar strategy so effective that modern architects studying the ruins at Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon have found that the interior temperatures of these structures remained within a livable range year-round with no supplemental heating system whatsoever. The thermal mass of the stone and adobe did the work entirely. These traditions were not primitive. They were locally optimized engineering solutions, developed over generations through the most rigorous testing methodology that has ever existed: survival. The structures that failed were abandoned. The structures that worked were copied, refined, and passed down. Every detail that persisted through multiple generations of copying: the wall thickness, the corner joints, the chimney placement, the foundation depth, persisted because it had been tested against real winters and found necessary. Callum Mackinnon carried two of those traditions in his hands and in his memory. He applied them in a valley where neither tradition was known, in a climate that matched the one those traditions had been built to address. The result was not surprising to anyone who understood the history. It was only surprising to those who assumed that the most recent way of doing something was necessarily the best. The tower itself, according to regional historical records, remained standing and inhabited for at least 40 years after the blizzard of 1886. A surveyor's note from 1923 describes it as a stone structure of unusual height, still sound, occupied by a family of the Mackinnon line. The last reference to the tower in available historical records dates to 1941, when a county land assessment lists the property as improved with one stone dwelling, condition good. What became of it after that point is not known from available records. But the principles it demonstrated have not become obsolete. Thermal mass construction has experienced a sustained revival in vernacular and sustainable building communities since the 1970s, driven in part by energy price shocks that made the metabolic inefficiency of lightweight frame construction suddenly and painfully visible. Earthship construction in the American Southwest, rammed earth building in Australia and the UK, stone and cob construction in Europe, and the contemporary passive house movement. All of them, in different ways and with different materials, are reaching back toward the same fundamental insight that Callum embodied in that northern valley. Mass stores energy. Geometry guides it. Patience allows it to work. And the blizzard, when it comes, does not ask who was right. It simply reveals who was prepared. There is a particular silence that follows the kind of winter Callum Mackinnon's valley endured in 1886. Not the silence of peace, the silence of reckoning. The silence of people standing in the ruins of what they thought was sufficient, measuring the distance between what they believed and what the land had decided. That silence has a way of producing questions that comfort never asks. And the most important question, the one that the blizzard forced every person in that settlement to confront, was not why did the tower survive? That question had an answer, and Callum gave it freely to anyone willing to listen in the spring of 1886. The more important question was the one that came before it, the one that no one had thought to ask during the 4 years of mockery and dismissal. Why did they assume they already knew enough? This is not a question unique to that valley, or to that decade, or to the specific problem of keeping a cabin warm in a northern winter. It is the question that appears with depressing regularity at the edge of every technological transition. The moment when a system that worked adequately under normal conditions is exposed by an extreme event, and the people who depended on that system are forced to confront the gap between adequate and resilient. The settlers of that valley were not foolish. They were building the way they had been taught, the way their neighbors built, the way the available materials and available time and available money suggested. They were optimizing for the conditions they expected, not the conditions they might face. This is an entirely human approach to risk, and it is also, in extreme environments, an approach that can become life-threatening with very little warning. Callum had been taught by a tradition that optimized differently. His inheritance, from the Finnish coast, from the Scottish Highlands, from a lineage of builders who had faced the same cold in different landscapes, was a tradition built around the question, what happens when the worst arrives? Not what is adequate for an ordinary winter, but what survives an extraordinary one. That shift in design premise, from average case to worst case, produced a fundamentally different building. Not more expensive, not dramatically more difficult, but different in its priorities and in its relationship to time and weather. The practical lesson is not build a stone tower. The practical lesson is older and more transferable than any specific material or method. It is this: the systems we rely on for warmth, for shelter, for the maintenance of a habitable life in a hostile climate. Those systems will be tested, not by the winners we plan for, but by the ones we don't. And the difference between a system that survives that test and one that doesn't is rarely a matter of technology or expense. It is almost always a matter of priorities, of what the builder chose to optimize for, of whether resilience was on the list at all. Callum's neighbors rebuilt their cabins in the spring of 1886. Several of them, as noted, rebuilt differently, with thicker walls, with stone foundations, with chimneys that ran through the interior rather than up the outside of the gable. They had learned what the valley had tried to teach them for 4 years in a single night. The knowledge was never hidden. It was simply ignored until ignoring it became impossible. That pattern, ancient knowledge dismissed, extreme event arrives, knowledge vindicated, is not a story about the past. It is a description of a recurring human condition. The frontier did not invent it. We did not outgrow it. We simply moved it indoors and gave it better lighting and called it progress. The stone tower stood for at least 60 years. The wooden cabins it outlasted were gone before a generation had passed. Ask yourself, honestly, which one you're building. Because the blizzard is not interested in your insulation rating. It is not impressed by your smart thermostat. It does not negotiate with your energy bill or acknowledge your construction permits. It arrives when it arrives, from whatever direction it chooses, at whatever temperature it decides, and it asks the same question it has always asked of every structure that stands in its path. Are you ready? Callum Mackinnon's answer was 51 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn, after the worst night in the valley's recorded history, with no fire tended since 10 p.m. The rest of the settlement had no answer at all. What did this stonemason understand that the modern world has quietly set aside? That is the question worth sitting with. Long after this video ends, long after the screen goes dark, and especially on the night when the wind picks up from the northwest and the temperature begins to fall. Some knowledge doesn't age. It only waits. Educational and historical content only. This script is not a substitute for professional engineering or construction guidance. All accounts marked as oral history or regional record represent historically plausible reconstruction based on vernacular building traditions of the period.